Ladies and gentlemen, the time is now basically 2 p.m. in Malmö, Sweden, and we thank you for joining us on this wonderful afternoon for the fourth installment of the World Maritime University Alumni Webinar Series. My name is Max Mejia, Professor of Maritime Law and Policy here at WMU, and I have the pleasure of acting as your moderator for this webinar with the theme COVID-19 and Shipping, Maritime Law and Policy Highlights. I would like to launch this webinar by inviting the President of the World Maritime University, Dr. Cleopatra Doumbia-Henry, to share with us her introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor. And let me certainly welcome with us as well in that webinar, Katie Hutton-Button, and for joining us and for being able to engage, of course, with our alumni. What I would like to say with respect to this very, very important issue, COVID-19, in which we are all now, we're all in the same boat. And has never been seen a bigger equalizer than in recent years than this pandemic. And of course, it's been a challenging one for everyone, and no less for the World Maritime University. But we are making sure that we remain resilient, take the necessary measures to ensure we are safe and secure, and of course follow all of the guidelines that have been provided. But this webinar, I think, it's absolutely timely that we address the issue of the role, in fact, from my perspective, the role of seafarers who are key workers for the global supply chain, and the important role and work and role that they play to enable shipping to happen. We all know that shipping is responsible for the carriage of 90% of world trade, that we have around 2 million seafarers worldwide working in this industry. It is a multinational, multicultural force, a workforce, and they are, in fact, the key workers for the global supply chain. With COVID, of course, and how the pandemic has rolled out, we've had huge issues in terms of how seafarers have been treated. Issues of concern, considering that every day at sea, there are more than 200,000 seafarers who actually have been stranded on or have been abandoned at sea, and who have not been able to undertake crew changes and repatriation as is required by the Maritime Labour Convention 2006. We've had over 100 cruise ships with more than 70,000 seafarers who have been waiting to be repatriated. In terms of COVID, clearly for us, concerns of crew change, travel, mental health issues, welfare and well-being means that seafarers have to have adequate psychosocial emergency care, medical supplies, fuel, water, and provisions for ships. Issues like cost to operators and potential legal consequences will be among the things that will have to be addressed in the future. But what was really important was that action had to be taken to ensure that countries who refuse to allow seafarers to disembark, to transit and transfer, and the impact that has had on their well-being. I was very pleased to see how the United Nations agencies came together and issued a range of circulars and letters and other guidance to ensure that the world respected the international instruments, and in times like these, seafarers as key workers could not, a key to the supply chain, and could not be left to their own devices. It is for this reason that I consider this discussion that you will have today and the exchange that you will engage in will enable us to ensure that we should be, and we must be the steward bearers And those people who make sure that people do the right thing, countries do the right thing, implement the international standards. And now is not the time to pull back and to short borders and not allow global trade, which can only happen for the goods that they all need. It can only be done if seafarers are enabled and entitled to have shore leave, and particularly considering the mental health issues that they will face in the future, and they already are facing now. I am really pleased to see that the IMO has issued 16 circulars relating to these issues. And I've seen the World Health Organization, the International Maritime Organization, ICAO, in other words, in terms of seafarers' access to aircraft and airlines to be able to be repatriated, shipped to shore, sort of disembarkation of seafarers and crew changes. It's been amazing to see how all the United Nations organizations have come together and jointly agree with the support of the industry. And there I want to highlight the role that the ITF and the ICS and the International Shipping Federation and other shipping organizations have played in themselves developing common guidance. And a lot of that is being used by the international community today. And for the first time, we could see, we could be proud of the maritime community and how they've banded and come together to ensure the rights of seafarers. So with these words, I'll leave that to you, and you will have a lot of to discuss in the next almost hour to engage in the issues as you see them. But I wanted to say how important this is for us, how important this, how close this is to my heart in terms of the effective implementation of the Maritime Labor Convention and the relevant IMO instruments that exist, as well as the WHO guidelines that relate to these issues, and to see the four UN agencies, IMO, ILO, WHO, and ICAO, come together and indicate that they were supporting the same cause and ensuring that the industry, that governments around the world did the right thing to enable global trade to continue to be effective and to take place. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cleopatra Doumbia Henry, President of the World Maritime University. Now we move on to the webinar proper. And I would just like to share some statistics relating to the participants this afternoon. We have more than 500 registrants, a record breaker for this series, and you are coming from 93 countries in all of the world's continents. Among you are participants from different institutions and organizations in the maritime sector, including our parent organization, the IMO. More than 200 of you are WMU alumni, and we send you warm greetings from your alma mater. I also note that many are currently enrolled as WMU students, and we also have WMU colleagues in attendance. We thank all of you for showing interest and registering for this webinar. COVID-19 is everywhere around us, and it is an understatement to say that it has affected the everyday life of everyone on this planet. The effects of this inestimable disruption have manifested themselves in shipping and the larger maritime industry in ways that we are only beginning to fathom. We are seeing flag states, coastal states, and labor supplying states having to rapidly adjust on the fly or wing it as countries retreat within their boundaries. The international legal framework that has been carefully built to ensure uniform implementation of standards and facilitation in global maritime commerce is being tested and stretched beyond its limits. We read of this major dry bulk shipping company running hundreds of millions of dollars in deficit, that container feeder line struggling to comply with its loan obligations, and this segment suffering from enormous exchange rate losses that we don't know who is afloat anymore. How about the now more than 200,000 seafarers awaiting relief and desperate to get home after serving beyond their contract periods, whose physical and mental health and well-being are now at great risk? Just like every other industry, shipping depends on the predictability, access to production, access to labor, access to markets, freedom of movement, and so many other prerogatives that in a span of a few short months seem to have unraveled like a house of cards. The maritime industry is desperate to regain its bearings. But when and how? This afternoon's webinar offers presentations on the topic of COVID-19 as it affects selected issues of maritime law and policy. We hope for this to be a thought-provoking, insightful, and informative session. Allow me then to introduce our panel of experts for this afternoon. We are honored to present to you Dr. Laura Carballo, Nippon Foundation Professor of Maritime Labor Law and Policy at the World Maritime University, Dr. Aref Fakhri, Associate Professor of Maritime Law and Policy, also here at WMU, and we three here are in Malmö. And joining us remotely from London is Ms. Katie Higginbottom, Head of the ITF Seafarers Trust. Our experts this afternoon will be presenting the following topics: application and enforcement of IMO conventions, the Seafarers Trust's COVID-19 emergency response, the balance between health protection and seafarers' rights, and supporting employment and shipping businesses. We will also be running a few poll questions midway during each presentation. You will see these pop up on your screen. We hope you will participate in the polls, the results of which I will be sharing towards the end. After our panel presentations, we hope to have time to field a few questions from our online audience. So now I'm happy to invite Professor Fakhri to give the first presentation. Aref.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Max. In speaking about the application of and enforcement of IMO conventions in this crisis, I initially thought of the notion of state of emergency. We are obviously in some kind of declared or undeclared state of emergency, and the first reflex was to check in the IMO conventions, what does it say about that? So if we can just maybe move on, or I'll do that. Yeah, thank you. So state of emergency in terms of force majeure, we've been hearing a lot about force majeure as a concept, and I thought we should elucidate that concept in the IMO conventions. In fact, I took a sample convention, the SOLAS convention, and I checked where force majeure actually is mentioned. It's only mentioned in one place, which is Article 4.1. It is quite circumscribed as it is there, because it only basically says that a vessel that commences its voyage without being subject to convention, if for any reason force majeure, somebody could argue that it then should fall under the IMO convention, the SOLAS convention, then that is not going to be an acceptable premise. So, and obviously there's a definition of force majeure that is well accepted. It is an irresistible, unexpected event. People could have argued that at the very beginning of the crisis, COVID-19 was maybe a cause of force majeure, but it is probable that that argument can no longer hold today, because we know that COVID-19 exists. It is now has become a fact of everyday life. I've also considered a concept that is provided in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, because that convention, which is sort of the mother of all conventions, applies to IMO conventions by default. And there's a concept there, which is the supervening impossibility of performance. Now, I'll spare you the reading of the whole article, but basically, what that concept does is that it allows contracting parties to conventions to withdraw or even terminate their engagement or their undertaking under the conventions. And if it says that if the impossibility is temporary, then that can only lead to a suspension. Now, the issue with this article that is displayed is that it talks, or it requires, the permanent disappearance or destruction of the object that is indispensable for the execution of the treaty. And I think that we could all argue that ships have not been destroyed, or that the channels of navigation neither. And that sort of limits very much the applicability of a concept like that to the in the realm of IMO conventions. So we have to kind of look for other solutions. I want to now sort of leave this issue of state of emergency and dive in on another very topical issue arising nowadays with health inspections, looking at it from the perspective of IMO conventions. So what do we find? We find that, after all, surprisingly, health inspections are not a matter that is really regulated in IMO conventions. The International Convention for the Facilitation of Maritime Traffic, FAL, basically preserves the sovereignty of the contracting parties to the convention to carry out health inspections as and when needed. And you have the terminology on the slide. Towards the end, it says that in order to prevent the introduction or spread of diseases affecting public health. So basically, we are in the realm of sovereignty. Of course, there's a reference to international health regulations, but in the core IMO conventions, we don't find that sort of regulation of the carrying out of health inspections. There are some provisions elsewhere. What that convention tries to do is to ensure that there's a level playing field, there's harmonization of documentation, and some extent of procedures also, a minimum level of understanding of what those procedures should be. So I want to now jump to another provision relating to these emergencies, and this is something that obviously we've seen in the press with cruise ships trying to disembark huge numbers of their passengers. And the same applies today to, you know, what's going to happen to the crew members of these stranded stranded crew members. So actually, the same convention, FAL, does provide for the putting ashore sick crew members, passengers, or other persons for emergency medical treatment. There are these provisions on the slide which kind of not directly oblige coastal states or port states to receive them. All that the convention does is to kind of put in place mechanisms for communication between the coastal authorities and the ship master. So it's kind of a very like discreet way of regulating such an important matter. Of course, there is a provision saying that a priority should be given to berthing of these vessels in the event that that is mandated by the state of the sick person. So there's a lot of background here, in the backdrop, a lot of issues of sovereignty of the coastal states. The issue of quarantine is interesting also. Quarantine is not really mandated or provided or prohibited in the FAL Convention. It's really up to the coastal state to decide on the measures that, according to them, have to be adopted in that respect. But at least they have to avoid conducting quarantining in a discriminatory manner, and that is what it is provided for in FAL. Interestingly, the mention of quarantine facilities relates to agricultural quarantine facilities. And there's a standard 7.8 on the at the bottom of the slide that says that public authorities shall facilitate the arrival and departure of ships engaged in the rescue of persons in distress. So that could be actually applicable in our circumstances. Let me just finish on this issue of what we're facing today with the IMO good offices. My president mentioned already the huge effort that has already been wielded by IMO to bring together a lot of efforts and organizations to come up with solutions. I want to just mention the issue of port state control and flag state implementation. Clearly, there's a pragmatic approach that is called for by the IMO on issues like remote inspection of vessels using cameras, using photos, using videos. Also the issue of the extended certificates or the expired certificates. I'm not sure that that is actually in conformity with the IMO conventions. But there is definitely a call for a pragmatic approach. So just a few words now on what is going to be the future for us. As stated by David Osler just a few days ago, the industry's working assumptions of recent decades are no longer given. So what can we look out for? In terms of maritime law and policy, I wanted to just say that we expect we can expect that sanitation and public health will be, there will be more of that in the IMO core work. I think that so far there are somehow a correlation. So there will be an impetus to facilitation, trade facilitation, digitization, because that actually saves us from having the physical contact. So much more focus on electronic commerce. We are already seeing shifting economies and geographies somehow. One of the downsides is that now we are dealing with the invisible shipwrecks, and those are the migrants in the Mediterranean that are not really accounted for because all the coastal and search and rescue facilities have sort of scaled down on their efforts. So no one is really seeing now the migrants, or not to the extent that we were able to see them before. But there are also leveraging. There are maybe some positive aspects to it. One of them is that ship emissions have reduced. And therefore, I think that we should expect that, this is a call for the international maritime community to leverage really the crisis and to look out for benefits. And I think I can end it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your presentation, Professor Fakhri. Now I would like to invite Ms. Higginbottom to give her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting introductory comments and first thoughts there. So let me start by saying thank you for inviting me to speak to this WMU webinar. The ITF Seafarers Trust is really very proud of its long association with the WMU, especially with our trust-funded scholars and alumni. So I'm really pleased to be able to share with you some information on what we've been doing in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on seafarers. Now, let's hope I can move my screen forward. Yes. So first, let me explain a little bit about the relationship between the ITF and the ITF Seafarers Trust. You may be more familiar with the ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, a global union federation representing workers from various transport sectors. It's a membership organization of affiliated trade unions from some 150 countries, representing almost 20 million workers. And the ITF coordinates a global response to its unions' concerns, and it represents the interests of workers in international organizations such as the ILO and the IMO. The ITF Seafarers Trust, by contrast, was created by the ITF in 1982 as a registered charity. So we have a remit to improve the welfare and well-being of seafarers and their families. And although our funding comes from the ITF, we're a completely separate entity, and we work with different partners to deliver projects and services for the benefit of seafarers. So, as you know, and as you've heard, the coronavirus is having a dramatic impact on the lives of seafarers, not just in terms of the disease itself, but because their key role is largely unrecognised outside of the maritime cluster or sector. Unfortunately, seafarers are rarely at the top of the agenda of policy makers in national governments and even at an international cooperation level. The response to the pandemic, in my view, has been sadly lacking for maritime, not because there hasn't been cooperation at an international, intergovernmental level in the maritime sector, but a difficulty in reaching outside of that. So this is really a disaster for seafarers who are obviously constantly traveling to and from vessels and between jurisdictions. Many have had to extend their contracts because of the inability of companies to organise crew changes. We can say, I think, that the companies are actually mostly doing their best, but are challenged by the lack of flights and the various different requirements around testing and quarantining, and the lockdowns in many countries that are preventing any kind of free movement. So I think it's important to be positive about the triumphs of coordination and cooperation, but the reality is seafarers are not recognised as the key workers that they are in most places, and are getting very, very frustrated about the fact that things are not aligning to really resolve this problem around crew changes. Probably you may know that the ITF, in cooperation and coordination with the Chamber of Shipping, agreed to extend the contracts by a month, and now they're in a second month after that they're calling an implementation period to allow governments enough time to respond to the protocols that have been put together. But it's not quite a done deal as yet, and there's obviously a backlog to be dealt with before we can say it's really a success. So I think seafarers are really understandably getting pretty fatigued and stressed and frustrated about the time apart from families, and becoming more and more sort of cynical and desperate about the lack of interest in resolving these logistical problems, which is of course on top of the anxiety of the disease itself, how that might be affecting their families, and the fear for the future around potential job losses and financial implications. So sorry, my next slide is not wanting to appear. Oh, here we go. What's the ITF and the Seafarers Trust doing? So as I mentioned, as different entities, the ITF is focusing on the political response. We in the Trust are trying to provide a kind of humanitarian support and a prompt response to the emergency situation. So the ITF is working together with the shipping industry to develop practical protocols and to lobby governments, especially around things like the key worker status and facilitating crew changes. We understand that there's some progress, but a lot more to be done. Particular problems I'm hearing still around West Africa, difficulties of getting people off or get at all arranging crew changes, but some things being improved and some flights opening up. From our side at the Seafarers Trust, we convened an emergency meeting of our trustees in March, and we committed £1 million for a COVID-related emergency support fund. We identified 2 particular areas for support. One was for seafarer centres and welfare services that were at risk of bankruptcy due to loss of the sort of fundraising opportunities. And we wanted to ensure that those facilities would still exist for seafarers beyond the current situation. The other was for emergency support for seafarers, primarily provided via unions, to give them PPE and food aid packages, counselling services, improvements of communication facilities in ports, and also funding for accommodation in hostels. So here you can see a little bit of a breakdown by region of the money we've spent. I think we were able to respond quite quickly. We've got through our $1 million within just over a month. We've given grants over 21 countries with a fairly broad geographic spread across continents. The largest segments for Europe, Oceania and North America reflect the location of seafarers centres and those that are continuing to provide services to crew. The African segment is mainly for sanitary facilities in ports, and the rest are mainly provisions for unions helping seafarers. So that's across 38 projects. This gives you a bit of a breakdown of the project type. So again, after the seafarers centres, we have a significant amount for PPE and then subsistence and accommodation. But we're also doing things like providing extra support for care homes for retired seafarers, this counselling and advice, port-based sanitary facilities. The SEF is a Seafarers Emergency Fund administered through a third-party organisation that's giving emergency grants to individuals. So I'd just like to end with some examples, pictures of some of the people we're working with. So top left, you've got the members of the Iranian Seafarers Union who we've been able to support. In the middle, the Koreans who are providing PPE in ports. I think top right is a German welfare organisation on board vessels giving out these portable Wi-Fi equipment, and some of the other packages of equipment that we've put together for people to give out to seafarers. So I hope that gives you an idea of some of the initiatives that are going on. There are many more. There's much more to be done. I think, unfortunately, it's times like these that the strengths and weaknesses of intergovernmental relations are really tested. You know, sometimes they work okay, sometimes not so much, and it's at times like this that charities have to come to the fore and spend the money. Sometimes we think it should be other people that are, for example, responsible for PPE or responsible for hygiene, but it's an emergency situation and we have to respond to the emergency. So we're very happy to have that income from the ITF to be able to do our best and work with the really great partners that we're working with. So I will leave it there. You have our contact details should you wish to follow us on social media, and obviously happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katie, Ms. Higginbottom. Now I would like to invite Professor Laura Carballo to give her presentation.
Thank you so much, dear Max, and welcome to the audience. Many thanks for being there and for being loyal to the university, and especially many thanks for your interest in the topic. I wanted to follow the lead of the president, of Max, of Aret, and Katie in joining my call for helping seafarers and other maritime workers at sea, and I wanted to frame the debate addressing the balance between health protection versus other human and labor. And want to move this, I cannot, and labor rights. In particularly the freedom of movement and the right to work, which have been incredibly affected by the COVID-19 crisis. In that regard, we need to remember that we already have a working international legal framework that is addressing the balance, addressing the need to apply the proportionality principle to the conflict between the right to health and the other rights that I have just mentioned, particularly the freedom of movement and the right to work. As you can see, we have the World Health Organization International Health Regulations 2005, whose purpose is pretty clear: to prevent, protect against, control, and provide a public response to the international spread of disease in ways that are commensurate with and restricted to public health risks, and which avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. I want to raise your attention to the Part 2 recommendations. Many of you for sure are already familiar with them. The recommendations that the WHO can issue include travel bans, total travel bans, but have not been recommended in this crisis by the UN agency. At the same time, in Part 5 of the HHR, of the regulations, public measures are addressed. And already there are a number of measures that address maritime, air traffic, the trade of goods in general, and especially they address the need to safeguard travelers against overly burdensome interferences in their freedom. So we already have an international framework that is fully working and already addressing the need to balance. Of course, it's necessary to undertake measures in order to protect health, but they shouldn't be overly burdened for travelers in particular and for the trade of goods, because that's essential for the survival of the countries. The problem with the regulations apparently is that they are not really treaty law, they are secondary law, and they do not have direct effect in the states. So the state really need to take the lead. In that regard, I want to remind the states that the regulations are not anything new, but they are the distill of principles and practices that are very old and that have been developed by the international system in order to address previous pandemics. This is not the very first pandemic. So I also want to mention here that already in 1851, there was the need, following a cholera pandemic, for the states to gather and to address the problems raised, the disparities raised by different measures adopted by states, and that they were already disrupting the international trade and travel. The focus of that specific conference was measures restricting maritime transportation. From that moment on, now we have a right to the international health regulations. They are in place. And the issue is that the international framework has reacted smoothly. We have already been discussing that all the UN organizations, not only IMO, or better said, in particular IMO, but also ILO, UNTAC as well, ICAO and WHO, of course, have issued a statement, guidelines, in order to make this balance between health protection and other human rights operative. The issue nowadays, in light of the situation, is whether we need to go forward, to move forward, and we really need to address what is now being called in the academic debates an international pandemic slot, because we really need to address, to reinforce state cooperation. The problem with all this situation, the closing of the borders, the disruption of the right to work and the freedom of movements, is that we are facing a major crisis. As you can see here, I was just compiling news from different media, and you can see that we are really already in the midst of a number of work furloughs and layoffs, increasing layoffs coming from very reputable and strong shipping companies. Let's see what happened with the small and medium companies. They are desperate, they are crying for help, they're crying from state aid. So the states, the countries really need to step in. It's not a moment that the state cannot provide support to, I want to refer here specifically to shipping companies, or the sectors are calling for that, but the reality is that companies are facing lack of liquidity, and by themselves, although the major private stakeholders are also taking actions like not claiming payments for the time being, states really need to put in place other type of measures. Only some countries are doing that, and the problem that we are facing now is that, according to, you can look for the EXA COVID-19 survey, very quickly done. I guess many of us are already feeling that, but we have some data there to look for, that there are some state aid system in place, but unfortunately, in particular, I want to highlight that they are not applicable to seafarers that are not residing in the countries that they are applying them. They are sent home without a job and without a job, basically. And then here I want to recall that we really need to remember that seafarers have the right to Social Security. Social Security, state Social Security is very weak when it comes to seafarers. We really need to start working here. We already have the obligation arising out of the Maritime Labour Convention, but we really need to remember that we need to provide a safety net to all seafarers. Speaking of state aid, it's not only about helping now seafarers, other type of measures need to be implemented. I wanted to remind here that the state aid needs to be carefully administered in order not to distort the market, and in particular to avoid zombie lending. So I have a couple of suggestions. One would be only covering companies whose business has been affected by COVID-19. Those companies that have problems before shouldn't be let out of the scheme. And by strictly supporting, of course, sustainable businesses and taking into account the 2013 agenda and sustainable development goals, and in particular the work and the many projects that the IMO already has in place to work towards that blue economy. And I want to suggest you to take into account in your national projects about reconstruction, about the crisis, to the Employment and Decent Work for Peace and Resilience Recommendation 2070 of the ILO, where you will find very useful guidance as to how to address the reconstruction. Talking of the liquidity problems that the companies are facing, some of them won't be able to take advantage of them, but they might take advantage of the insolvency schemes of each country. Insolvency systems have evolved quite a lot. Nowadays, it's not just about liquidation, it's also about saving viable businesses via debt restructuring and debt refinancing. So that could be a very good complementary way to help shipping companies to survive, to go through the crisis. The problem is that they are international, and then what to do if countries decided to take a piecemeal approach? I mean, just to open one insolvency proceeding in each country where the company has assets. Well, nowadays we have an international approach based on the UNCITRAL cross-border insolvency model law. Quite a number of countries has joined that model. Others are simply follow it, although not openly joining it. And then we have one insolvency proceeding with universal scope. That would mean that just one jurisdiction would be able to help the company to recover. There are some concessions in order to protect local interests. And in that regard, I want to remember that there are special rules for secure creditors. And here I want to jump into the link with maritime law, because secure creditors are, of course, those with maritime liens and claims. And the ranking has to be respected also in the insolvency proceeding, meaning that the conventions on maritime liens and mortgages also apply within the insolvency proceeding. The problem is whether this type of secure creditors, the maritime creditors, have the right to separate enforcement and to pursue the judicial sale of ships, forgetting that the ship might be necessary in order to recover the COVID. Well, it is a very difficult balance that only some jurisdictions have addressed. I mean, the insolvency law goes on one side and the maritime law goes on the other side. They do not apparently speak clearly to each other, so we have kind of a blur. And I was just to finish my presentation, indicating that, in my opinion, in these times we should stick to the maritime framework and actually to allow to go for the ship arrest and ship sale, because we need to protect creditor satisfaction, which is a means to avoid the disruption of international trade as little as possible. So I am going to finish now my presentation, and here just I want to leave my takeaways. Make please the WHO international health regulations and all related statements and guidelines issued by the UN institutions work, support shipping companies to secure employment and global fair competition, include seafarers regardless of nationality in support schemes, we shouldn't forget them, and prioritize secure maritime creditor protection in case of insolvency. Many thanks.
Thank you, Professor Caballo. That brings us to the end of our panel presentations. And now we would like to enter our Q&A session. I'll start with a question that is being asked directly of our first speaker, Professor Fakri. Arif, bearing in mind an ongoing IMO IX initiative regarding statutory certification, could you develop your thinking, quickly alluded to, that it might not be within the scope of IMO instrument?
Thank you for that question. Yes, because I actually was expecting a question on that. I'm just trying to retrieve my my notes on it. So basically, I looked at the SOLAS convention in terms of certification, and if you have SOLAS regulation 1, Roman numeral 1/14, basically it says that when the ship or a certificate is about to expire and the ship is not in the ports or the offshore facilities of the flag state, then the flag state can extend the certificate to allow the ship to proceed to the ports for of that flag state in order for it to be surveyed or inspected again. That is the only way provided for in terms of SOLAS. Another situation is where a certificate is extended for a period of grace, and that's only up to 1 month. So the earlier instance is basically up to, I think, a couple of months. So my argument is that there are no provisions made in SOLAS, to take that example, to extend certificates validity other than because of the or through the mechanism that is already provided for. So we are in a way of in the midst of a quandary here. I could go to the extent of sort of signaling a gray area when it comes to the circular letter in my obviously academic stance here, not criticizing anyone or any organization, but it just calls into question to what extent that tallies with the mechanism for extending the validity of expired certificates or certificates about to expire according to the provisions that we have in the IMO conventions. So I hope that sort of answers a bit the question.
Thank you, Professor Fakhri. The next question I have from the audience relates to Katie, Ms. Higginbottom. Somebody wanted to know, is there ITF presence in Indonesia?
Yes, there is. There's a very active union called KPI. I can't pronounce it in Indonesian, but I'm happy to send the full name. And we have supported them quite recently. They've started especially trying to help seafarers coming back from the cruise ships with provisions and sort of welcome packages when they've been required to go through quarantine. And they're also involved in establishing more seafarer centres. So it's the union, but they're also very practically involved in welfare.
Thank you, Katie. Our next question is I think to be answered by Professor Laura Carballo. It goes, will the IMO and the United Nations be prepared if the maritime industry will be hit by a second wave of COVID-19 or other pandemic?
Well, I think that the question is that IMO and the UN, after what we have seen about the legislation that the regulations and provisions that are in force, they are already prepared to address that. The problem, as it has been highlighted here by Katie in particular, is that we need the states to cooperate. I mean, to open their borders and to really address the health problems that they are facing, or trying to protect the health of their countries, following the international regulation and without totally canceling the other rights. There is here clearly also an economic problem, because once the traditional, the usual travel means had been stopped, and I think it has already been raised by one of the questions, well, the companies are charging exorbitant rates, and that creates another problem for many countries actually to open their borders. Well, not to open their borders, just to manage to get travelers go from one country to the other, and in particular seafarers. In that regard, the international organizations have been trying, especially the non-governmental organizations, have been trying, as we have learned also from Katie, to provide some resources, additional resources. But in that situation, it is up to the states and to their budgets, unfortunately, really to cover for these expenses in a meaningful way. There has been relaxation as to public service contracts and the possibility to establish that service, because it's absolutely necessary. Just contracting with one company when before it was submitted to the open competition, but nowadays we really need to go for state aid if we want to keep the services operating. It's a very difficult moment when passengers are at home, when travelers in general are at home, except for the key workers. and that's really damaging a lot the industry. Now is the moment to support them.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I have another question from the audience for Professor Parkley. I'll read it. It's on flag state and port state responsibility. Last February, a cruise ship, Diamond Princess, registered in the UK, entered into a Japanese port with a large number of passengers suspected to be COVID-19 infected. As a port state, Japanese authorities took measures to deal with patients and quarantined the cruise ship. Other cruise ships were denied entry into port since these cruise ships have suspected passengers, and littoral states were not ready to accept patients. What would be the responsibility of the flag state with passengers infected with such a disease? Does the littoral state have a duty to accept such cruise ships for the treatment of patients on board?
Okay, thank you for that question, which is a bit of a long-winded question, which is an excellent question for my students as an essay. So I'll try to muster some thoughts on that. So the responsibility of the flag state with in terms of passengers, IMO conventions do not really provide on that. So this is really outside of the area of competence of the IMO. Conventions, at least, do not go into the responsibility of the flag state vis-a-vis passengers. So we have a convention of the IMO, a fundamental convention of the IMO, touching on the liability of the carrier of the passengers. So really, ultimately, the liability should be channeled toward the liability of those passengers. And that is provided for in the Athens Convention, for instance, of the IMO. In order to invoke liability against the flag state, this is a bit of a complex question in international law because of the immunity usually that is granted to states in that sense. The other question is whether the littoral state has a duty to accept such cruise ships for the treatment of patients on board. And I think in my sort of quick overview, I kind of pointed out that at least in terms of the IMO conventions, there does not seem to be an obligation, a clear obligation for states, for coastal states to receive persons like that. It's up to the sovereignty of the states. Possibly a solution could be found in the international health regulations. I'm not really competent on that, but at least in terms of the core IMO regulations regarding maritime space, that does not seem to be, there does not seem to be a clear obligation to do that, apart from the one I mentioned where there has to be a priority given for berthing of those ships. And just to finish off on the question, that was answered by my colleague, if I may, Max, I think that ultimately the IMO system is working. And all that we are trying to point out are perhaps areas where there seem to be a stress point or directions for possible development in the future.
Thank you, Ara. I'd like to go back to London, to Katie. There's a question here about ITF reviewing protocols. Perhaps I could invite Katie to read the question and answer it.
Thank you, Max. So we have a question. When will ITF review the implementation of the IMO framework of protocols for member states and organizations? And will there be any sanctions for those who don't comply with these protocols? So I'm not sure I'm entirely qualified to answer the question, but I definitely would like to comment on it. So my view is that many of the protocols that have been put together, particularly with the cooperation and coordination of the ITF and the ICS, show a real effort to develop tools, to develop practical tools by the industry, by the unions and those representing seafarers, to offer to governments a way out of some of these impasses that are really complex problems. So, and I think it has been said, there are lots of strengths within the maritime sector in terms of this kind of tripartite cooperation, obviously kind of exemplified in the Maritime Labour Convention. And I think some of the sort of history of the Maritime Labour Convention and the way in which it forces people to work together, and that it creates a kind of imperative to have these cooperative procedures, has fed into these protocols. So I think it's being seen as an active tool to try and sort of guide a way out of this crisis of logistics. Now, as a tool and as really more sets of guidelines and templates, there are not so many obvious sanctions, and the ITF generally doesn't occupy a position where it can take official sanctions against states or even organizations. The situation really is, what are the seafarers going to do? How long can you expect 200,000 seafarers to be sitting effectively in prison at sea, not able to shift? And if they can't see a prospect of a way out of that situation, what are they going to do? So obviously individually they can't do very much, but it's a lot of people in a very difficult situation that have to be taken into consideration in order to avoid that desperate measures aren't taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. We have time for just one more question, and I'll ask this of Professor Carballo. The question is, what do you think about the protection of fishing vessel crews? Would it also be protected under the IMO conventions, that is about their unpaid wages?
Thank you so much for that question, because I mean, of course, we have not forgotten about the distant fishing and about all of those fishers that are out there, and they also need to go back to their homes. So the problem is much bigger, because it's not only the seafarers, but it's of course the fishers. So many thanks for that question. Their rights are, for the time being, covered. I mean, they are included. I mean, the IMO has also responsibility upon fishers when it comes to the labor rights and paid wages. Is about the question. We have to go to the Working Fishing Convention, that is parallel to the Maritime Labour Convention. There is a question also about whether we need the modification of the Maritime Labour Convention. As regard to seafarers and taking into account the pandemics. As it has already been mentioned here, the international framework is out there, is protecting both seafarers and fishers. It could be much better in terms of enforcement, but the rights are, to a certain extent, because I insist, there is a huge problem of enforcement. It's even worse in fishing, because the Working Fishing Convention has not been ratified. So this is a call for you, please, to go to work and also ratify the Working Fishing Convention along with the Torremolinos Convention and all the STCWF Convention that is applicable to them. But I want to finalize reminding again the international health regulations. I mean, there is a problem here of balance. We have different rights. The right to health comes first. There is no doubt about that. But then we need to protect that right, taking into account that there are other rights at stake. We need to strike a balance. And for that, for the time being, the best instrument we have is the international health regulations that already address shipping in a detailed manner and try to talk to other international instruments. We need to remember that all instruments are talking to each other. I don't think that we need to reform the international instruments, but maybe we really need to think about how to make them better cooperate or expose to the general community how they are talking to each other and how we can make that balance real between states. State cooperation, enforcement of the framework that we have is of the essence. It's not up to the international organizations. They can help, they provide support, they provide capacity building, they provide money if they have, if they have that money, of course, in order to help. But the state cooperation is of the essence. In this situation, where we have escalating rates when it comes to repatriate and the money is too much, I mean, that cooperation is even more important. We need to remember that we are all in this, and one state cannot just decide, I am going to be by myself alone. The problem is not going to go away. The problem of the virus has already demonstrated that can cross the border, but the same applies to trade. The world we live in is an international one. Borders are crossed. The trade is basically international, so we really need to enforce, to enhance that state cooperation. If one country cannot provide the resources to help, for example, the fishers or seafarers come back home, another states have to jump in, because we are talking of an international force. Thank you, Max.
Thank you, Laura. I hate to break this up, but we're basically used up our 1 hour. But before we end, I'd like to thank, of course, the panel for fielding the questions, and I'd like to thank the audience. I only regret that we're not able to answer all of the excellent questions. There's so many excellent questions that we received. But before we finish, of course, I would like to share with you the results of the polling. And here we are. Let's see. For poll number 1, do you think that the existing international maritime regulatory framework is sufficient for dealing with pandemics? Yes, 31%. No, 71%. And I do not know, 15%. Poll number 2, has your country designated seafarers as key workers? 41% said yes. 34% said no, and 25% answered, I do not know. Poll number 3, what should be the #1 priority in the pandemic recovery period? Laissez-faire with little government interference garnered 12%. Public funding to support companies in difficulty, 82 out of 202. Sustainable business models, 120 of 202, and undecided, 13 of 202. That's 13%, 41%, 59%, and 6%, respectively. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. We thank you for participating in our polls. I'd like to first thank my fellow members on the panel, Laura, Katie from London, and Aref. And I'd like to thank our WMU colleagues who've made this webinar possible. Sue Jackson, Pete Marriott, and Charlotte Wara. And of course, special thanks to our president who found time to welcome us this afternoon. So this brings us to the end of the webinar. We thank you very much for showing interest and for joining us this afternoon. From all of us, wishes for a safe, healthy, and happy weekend to you all. Goodbye.